Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA. First, a word from our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional, independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitor is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in over 750 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance program, visit our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. Some of the stories we look at this week are Dave LaForte's Top 10 Takeaways from Compliance Week 2019, Jeff Kaplan on why ethics matters at the top, how the UN Convention Against Corruption can help Mozambique recover funds stolen through corruption, and OFAC enforcement action that intrigued Matt Kelly, on the French of why pre-acquisition due diligence from the compliance perspective is now critical. Jay Rosen continues his series on monitorships with an article on how much monitorships cost. Mike Volkov takes a deep dive into your investigative protocol by auditing it. Why is visibility key for compliance? And Citco now is a part of the PDVSA Venezuelan corruption scandal. Finally, we conclude with, is there a legal duty to have an appropriate tone at the top for compliance and ethics? Fascinating exploration. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. And now, C-Suite Radio. Hello, everyone. Tom Fox back with Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors, for This Week in FCPA, episode 156 for the week ending May 31, 2019, the Farewell to May edition. Jay, if you weren't aware, let me tell you that the Houston Astros still have the best record in baseball. So they didn't sweep the Red Sox. They only won 4 of the last 6. So, a little bit of a downer there. We didn't get the sweep, but hey, our heads are still held high. But we had a lot of great stories this week. So you want to just jump right into it?
Let's go for it. You're recently back from the gathering of the tribe in DC for Compliance Week. So what kind of feedback do you have from the folks who attended?
So a couple of things. First of all, Dave LaForte, the editor-in-chief at Compliance Week, put together a great sort of wrap-up from his perspective. Dave is a journalist by heart from your part of the world, ESPN in Beantown. So he's not a compliance practitioner. So it's always great when he kind of weighs in because he has such a different perspective on things. And he had a top 10 of highlights for himself, including the DOJ's policy preview of the leniency program under the Antitrust Division, Christy Grant Hart's keynote, Wei Chin's keynote, the keynote by Preet Bharara, the keynote around psychology and compliance, behavioral ethics, the impact of cannabis legislation on corporate compliance programs, cybersecurity, and a decision tree for compliance. I was lucky enough to sit down with the co-host of Great Women in Compliance, Mary Shirley, Lisa Fine, and we were joined by our colleague Amy Bernard-Bond to do a podcast on our reflections of the conference. We cross-posted that podcast this past week on the Great Women in Compliance and FCPA Compliance Report. So some good stuff around the Compliance Week conference that we've linked to, Jay.
Perfect. So next up, I have an article coming from Jeff Kaplan in his Conflict of Interest blog. And everybody knows about tone at the top. But in this article, Jeff is writing about the toll at the top. And recently there was a PwC report done, and 39% of 89 CEOs who were interviewed or were that they focused on who departed jobs in 2018 left for reasons related to unethical behavior stemming from allegations of sexual misconduct or ethical lapses connected to things like fraud, bribery, and insider trading. So that's a pretty big number, 40% of 89. And basically, there are 5 issues that were identified in a recent Harvard Law School corporate governance blog. And what companies should be looking at doing is making sure that sexual misconduct risk is specifically enumerated and oversight is assigned to a board committee. The board should have expertise in workplace and employee issues. There should be material penalties in place for perpetrators and abettors. Executive compensation structures at a minimum should contain incentives for creating safe and equitable workplace, and the company should model the behavior that it seeks to promote. So this might be a new thing to be talking about the toll at the top, but it just kind of keeps capping off what we talk about, unfortunately, week to week and month to month, that there are people out there who are not playing by the rules, and it just makes our job even more important.
So let me just say, Jay, that this article really hit on several really important topics, but it's multiple topics. You articulated the need for robust oversight, but it's also having a safe space to raise your hand and speak up, having people that will listen, having an investigative function that takes these matters seriously, investigating, having that oversight committee that you mentioned, but also delivering discipline. In the form of this report noted, multiple CEOs or senior managers in the C-suite had to leave companies not because of negative financial performance. And I really think it speaks to the overall impact of not just Me Too, but compliance functions. We're going to detail a little bit later on an article from Mike Volkov, I think an ancillary part of this, which is auditing your investigative program, but really a lot to unpack. And I was frankly stunned that the number of people was so much higher who had left corporations for this reason as opposed to negative financial results.
So we've got another story. Last week we went down to Mozambique, and what's the update?
So Mozambique is in a world of hurt because of bribery and corruption. Bonds floated to purchase or build a tuna fleet. And although Charlie the tuna is glad that it didn't work out, the country of Mozambique is much worse for the wear, with the original loans of $2.2 billion and projected losses with penalties and interest for non-payment of up to $10 billion. And this is with a country with a total GDP of $12 billion. So you can see the problem. It turns out that the United Nations Convention Against Corruption may offer some bit of help. Rick Messick, writing in the Global Anti-Corruption blog, points out that under the UN Convention Against Corruption, a government can directly recover much, if not all, through Article 53, which requires any signator to the convention grant a petitioning party a right to civil action to recover property acquired through offenses defined in the convention. Obviously, this includes bribery and corruption. So this could really open up a new front of international litigation as regime change brings not only increased scrutiny around bribery and corruption, but attempts by new governments to obtain or recover funds that were illegally, unethically, and criminally purloined from their countries, whether that be through theft, whether it be through bribery and corruption, or as in the case of Mozambique, fraudulent floating of bonds.
So next up, we've got something from our good friend in Boston, Matt Kelly at Radical Compliance. And we're taking a look at a recent action against State Street Corporation that was received from the Office of Foreign Assets Control on Tuesday. OFAC cited State Street for violating Iran sanctions because the bank acted as a custodian for a customer's retirement plan and processed $11,365 worth of pension payments to the customer a U.S. citizen while he was residing in Iran in the 2010s. On one hand, OFAC did not impose any monetary penalty against State Street because the bank used screening software that found the suspicious payment, and they self-reported the transactions to the compliance staff. The issue that you had is there were two different divisions at State Street, and one division, the retiree services staff, used its own sanction screening filter instead of that of State Street's centralized sanction screening filter. So basically, it's, I guess on one hand, they're saying it's good that they caught the suspicious payment, but on the other hand, State Street did not understand that it had problems that the bank needed to correct. Above all, it streamlined the escalation procedure so that when a sanctions risk now does emerge, it goes to the compliance professional with enough expertise and authority to resolve the question properly. So the other important lesson that Matt takes from this is that the enforcement action is simply that OFAC took action at all. It's a sign that OFAC is indeed looking at transactions like this, which exist almost entirely in the U.S. legal and regulatory system. So Matt usually has a very keen eye at looking at some of these more fintech solutions, and it just shows that I think OFAC is going to be more vigilant on this going forward. Any takeaways, Tom?
Yeah, a couple, Jay, in addition to the points you raised. I was a little troubled by the discussion around having the business unit involved, the specific business unit involved, the criticism for its compliance function and its compliance program, because on the one hand, if you want to operationalize your compliance program, that would seem to mitigate against or argue at least against having a centralized compliance function. But here, the operationalized compliance function completely failed. And indeed, the business unit where these OFAC infractions occurred, the compliance function actually approved a very large number of transactions. So the question becomes, or at least I would hope they did a root cause analysis to try to determine how could the business unit compliance function screw up so badly. It was clear knowledge within the bank that this was illegal conduct. And does this mean we're now going to move back towards or pull back from an operationalized compliance function to a more centralized compliance function? I've worked in companies where compliance was absolutely centralized in the corporate office. There are strengths to that, but there are also weaknesses. And some of the weaknesses led to the notion of operationalizing your compliance program. But if we're going to pull back from that now, I think that's going to have to be an ongoing and continued conversation, Jay.
So next up, Tom, we go to our good friends in France, and they always have some interesting things to say about M&A transactions. So what is happening with the French Anti-Corruption Authority, the AFA?
So actually, Jay, I would have to say the French have never said anything interesting about compliance and connection with M&A, and that's what makes this article so interesting. Found in the Compliance and Enforcement blog, the most excellent blog from the New York University program on corporate compliance and ethics, entitled French Anti-Corruption Authority Raises Alarm About M&A Transactions. And the French Anti-Corruption Agency or Authority, AFA, did exactly what you said. They raised the alarm about M&A and that there needs to be robust pre-acquisition due diligence and, of course, post-acquisition investigation to determine if there are any corruption violations. In the simple words, the AFA's pitch boiled down to French companies do investigate target companies, and if you find something wrong pre or post closing, come and talk to us early so we can take care of the situation, or you may face the Department of Justice or the Serious Fraud Office. So that's a pretty strong statement. But Jay, the thing that struck me is the growing international recognition of the need for robust compliance around the entire spectrum of M&A, from the pre-acquisition, due diligence, through closing, to integration, to post-acquisition forensic investigation, and the notification of authorities if something is askance. Because as I always say, if a company was engaging in bribery and corruption before you bought them, and they continue to engage in bribery and corruption after you have closed the deal, it is no longer they, it is now you who are violating the law. So I thought this was a pretty significant announcement from the French authorities and really shows the internationalization of not simply anti-bribery and corruption enforcement, but compliance programs as well.
So are we supposed to portend that there should be some announcement coming out soon about a French violator? Do you think that happens? Or do you think this was just put out there in a vacuum?
No, we're going to change the name of Freedom Fries back to French fries, though.
Yoo-hoo. All right. So number 6 comes back to me. This is part 5 in my series about everything you always wanted to know about a monitor, but were afraid to ask. And I take a look this week on my column in Corporate Compliance Insights about how much will a corporate monitorship cost. And, basically this is an area that tends to be quite confusing to certain people. And there are some certain factors that you can look at to get some certainty on what the cost will be. First of all, you want to look at the scope of the monitorship. And you need to understand the settlement documents so that you can fully appreciate the scope of the monitor's remit and what the government expects from the monitor. The next thing you want to look at is the frequency of engagement. How often will the monitor actually be interacting with your business units? Is this going to be a daily, weekly, or quarterly basis? And also, what is the exact duration of the term? And that, again, is usually listed in your settlement agreement. Next, you want to look at the experience of the monitor, and not specifically the experience in one vertical, but their experience in actually running a monitorship. And then these next 2 points become kind of critical. One is about cost control in the work plan, so that really needs to be agreed upon before you move out. And the last part is selective sampling. So if you've done a lot of these monitorships, like affiliated monitors, we've done over 750 of them, you get a pretty good idea of what you need to check. So you don't have to look under every rock, and you really can do sampling. And if you do find an issue that's a little bit more troubling, you can always dive in deeper. But by minimizing the scope, by looking at the frequency and looking at the experience of your monitor, you can really have a good idea how to constrain costs. Next up, Tom.
Yet another former PDVSA or PDVSA-related corruption case. And I don't want to downplay this, Jay, although it is now the 21st individual indictment and or conviction/guilty plea of defendants charged in connection with bribery in and around PDVSA. I guess we've had 16 guilty pleas and 5 are under indictment. Jay, the thing that struck me here as extraordinarily significant was that in addition to bribes paid directly to PDVSA officials, there were bribes paid to Citgo employees. Now, Citgo is based in Houston. It seems like to me they've got some placard or something up around Fenway Park in the back of my mind, like a small 6x4 or something. Maybe you can help me with that. But something there. But now we have the situation where if this is correct, and we have the businessman admitting the FCPA offenses, that bribes paid to a U.S. company were the basis of corruption involving PDVSA. And this opens up Citgo to an absolute world of hurt. First of all, now, if you work for Citgo and you're listening to this and you still work there, I would not walk but run to the Securities and Exchange Commission and tell them what you know, because you're going to need some serious whistleblower protection. And Citgo may be in for a very long and lengthy investigation. But if you're the SEC or the Department of Justice, you need to start investigating Citgo now. But once again, the difference, Jay, is this is an American company, not a payment of bribes by an American or other to a foreign government official, a payment of bribes to an American to garner a benefit on a foreign government official. And that really changes, I think, the entire dynamics of the PDVSA investigation. I don't know how closely you follow economic sanctions against Venezuela, but that's a huge issue here in Texas. Citgo is in spite of the fact they've got their placard in Boston, they're a Texas-based corporation. And there's, I think, 3,000 to 4,000 employees in Texas who work for Citgo, literally from gas station attendants all the way up to the corporate office. And now this entire company may go under investigation. And then the sanctions, which this administration has carved Citgo out of the sanctions against Venezuela, even though Citgo is owned by PDVSA 100%, they may come down on Citgo like a ton of bricks if it turns out that Citgo has been facilitating corruption by PDVSA, whether that corruption is money laundering, evasion of sanctions, or plain old payment of bribes under the FCPA. But I really think this opens up an entirely new front. And I think if you're a stockholder of Citgo and you're listening to this, I would think it's time to sell.
Totally. So this next story comes to us again from the FCPA blog by Elsa Chan, and more banks behaving badly. And in a 4-month span, there have been 4 scandals involving at least $2 trillion in money being laundered across the world. Some of these we've spoken about before: Danske Bank, Troika, Swedbank, and now the newest member of banks behaving badly is Standard Chartered. Having the right information at the right time can be the linchpin to catching some of these. And a big number that is out there is financial institutions spend an estimated $25.3 billion with a B on anti-money laundering compliance across the U.S. And part of this is, as we've talked about in the past, is you need to get additional information and data such as ultimate beneficial ownership. And one of the things that may or may not be limiting the effectiveness in this is organizations need to take a look towards increasing or in sharing information between financial institutions. They need to focus on the obvious. Often organizations get stuck using legacy technology. And finally, if organizations are to safeguard their reputations and increase efficiencies across compliance department, they need to look to empower the compliance team. So there is no silver bullet, but there is indeed a need for smarter data and not just faster tech. So a lot of these informations come down to us having the right technology at our hands. And hopefully, according to Elsa Chan, that if companies make these changes, they can be more efficient in weeding out these bad situations. Next up, Tom, we've got an article from the Harvard Law School Forum on corporate governance and financial regulation. And what about management's duty to set the right tone at the top?
So before we get to that, Jay, I wanted to highlight a multi-blog part series by Mike Volkov, who's run this week, and I alluded to it earlier, but he took a look at auditing your investigative protocol, and this is not something that really gets a lot of play, but it should. And in the 3-part series, Mike details specifically part 2, the information that you need to audit, how you need to put it together, how you need to review it. And then in part 3, he talks about remediation. So it's a great 3-part series. And I'm not sure I've ever seen an audit program or audit protocol around your investigative protocol. So this is really great nuts and bolts stuff from Mike. Yeah, so I really wanted to spend a little time on this article, Jay, because this has huge implications for not only compliance officers and compliance practitioners, but corporations as well. So the background of this case is Hertz in May 2014 announced it couldn't file its 10Q because it identified errors in its financial statements and ended up having to restate financials in 2015 for the years 2011, 2012, and 2013. It terminated its former CEO, former CFO, former general counsel, and former group president in part because of these financial restatements. And Hertz is seeking to recoup or claw back certain bonus payments that were made to these executives for hitting their numbers. So far, so good. So far, really nothing new in that. But what is new, Jay, is that the allegation is that not that the officers violated their fiduciary duties, because those claims would have been covered by D&O insurance. Hertz is specifically seeking recoupment of monies for engaging in conduct that constituted willful gross negligence or gross misconduct with regard to their duties. And those duties include setting an appropriate tone at the top. So what we have here is a company trying to utilize one of the great compliance maxims and make it a legal duty. So does an officer have that duty, and is it legally cognizable to set a tone at the top? To the extent such a duty exists, what's the source of that duty? What's the content of that duty? How does that duty compare to the Caremark duty of directors? Does failure to satisfy that duty amount to gross negligence? How do you measure that? How do you assess that? And what obligations does the board have respect to tone at the top? These are just some of the questions posed by this litigation. And this is really going to be interesting if the court allows this to go forward. And I have to emphasize if, meaning it'll have to pass a motion for summary judgment. It's in Delaware State Court. Then we can have a whole new set of legal duties. And if they can create a legal duty, Jay, around tone at the top, they can probably create a legal duty around any best practice of a compliance program, whether that be the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program, the OECD 13 good practices, the UK Bribery Act, 6 principles of inadequate procedures, really anyone. But this is something that really is new that I think we're going to have to watch.
Definitely. So you usually bless us with a 5-part podcast every week. What was the new podcast that came on this week, and what is the concern?
So, Jay, this week I had a 5-part podcast series, which was sponsored by Hanzo and our good friend Sean Friedland, he and his marketing team. We took a look at the use of AI and data analytics and compliance investigations. We looked at the current state of investigations using AI and web-based evidence, overcoming investigative challenges, improving investigative efficiencies, and where investigations are headed. It's available on all my sites. I'm extraordinarily pleased to announce that I've joined the C-Suite Radio Network, a business podcast network, so it's also available there. And then perhaps if I could give a teaser, Jay, next week's series is going to have your colleague, your AMI colleague, Eric Feldman, and we're going to take a very deep dive into the Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs 2019 guidance released by the Department of Justice in April of this year. It's going to be a great exploration. Eric really hit this one out of the ballpark, and I'm very excited about it. So, if you're listening to this podcast and you want to take a deep dive into the 2019 guidance, definitely check out next week. It'll post Monday through Friday on the FCPA Compliance Report. It goes up on iTunes, Spotify, Megaphone, all Monday night or Monday morning around midnight, so you can download and binge listen.
So speaking about Beantown and that Citgo sign, we're going to be there in a couple weeks. What's bringing us to Boston?
So we got a lot going on, Jay. I'm joined by you and a couple of colleagues for a 2-day masterclass. We've just gotten a new location that we'll put in the show notes on June 11 and 12. Listeners who sign up through this podcast, they get a complimentary copy of my book, The Compliance Handbook. We've got links to registration and information. And then on Thursday, June 13th, I hope you can join myself, Jay's colleagues, Eric Feldman and Vin DiCiani, and Jay at a roundtable in Boston where we take a deep dive into the new guidance. So you'll have a chance to really hear Eric expand upon his remarks from the podcast series. And once again, we've linked to the registration and information in our show notes.
Great. So do you want to gloat a little bit more about the Astros, or did you get it all out in the opening?
You mean the team with the best record in baseball? No, Jay, I'm pretty low key about such things. And, I don't really think you really should gloat when your team is hammering everyone else, because it makes everyone else just, feel so small. And, that's not my style to really talk about the Astros being the best team in baseball. I'm just going to enjoy it.
Okay. So I think that does it. On behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for joining us for This Week in FCPA, episode 156 for the week ending May 31st, 2019, the Farewell to May edition. Have a great weekend, and we'll be back in touch with you next week.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. I hope you will join Jay and I at one of the events in Boston. Once again, if you would like to attend the masterclass and you listen to this podcast, you can get a free copy of my seminal book, The Compliance Handbook, if you attend. Registration information is in the show notes. Also, Affiliated Monitors will be sponsoring a roundtable on Wednesday, June 13th. We will link to that in the show notes as well. This is Tom Fox. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope you'll join Jay and I again next week, where we take a look at some of next week's top stories in compliance and ethics. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network and C-Suite Radio. Thank you for listening.